These allegations, they're against you?
I'm Clara, 32-year-old. The second I walked into that courtroom, my mother, Isabella, rolled her eyes. It wasn't a subtle gesture, it was a performance. The kind of slow, deliberate eye roll that travels from the floor to the ceiling, a theatrical sigh in motion that screamed, "Here we go again." To her, I wasn't a daughter fighting for her grandfather's legacy. I was an inconvenience, a stubborn stain on her perfectly crafted victim narrative. But then something shifted in the room. The air crackled. Judge Evans froze, his gaze lifted from the stack of paperwork before him, his eyes locking onto my face. I watched the moment unfold in slow motion, the slight parting of his lips, the sudden stillness of his hand, the way recognition hit him not like a freight train, but like a ghost walking through a wall. A tremor went through him. "Wait," he breathed, the word barely a whisper in the cavernous room as his pen slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the polished wood. "These allegations, they're against you." My parents, Isabella and Mark, had spent 3 decades cultivating a blissful ignorance about who I really was. They saw me as the forgotten child, the quiet girl raised by her grandparents, easily intimidated and easily dismissed. And honestly, their ignorance was my greatest advantage. They had no idea the woman they were suing was the one person who knew all their secrets. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you've ever felt like a stranger to your own family, hit that like and subscribe button. Because you'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. So, to understand how we got here, how I ended up in a legal battle against the two people who were supposed to protect me, let me take you back 3 months to the day the world as I knew it ended. My grandfather died. To say that feels impossibly small. It's like saying a star burned out. Judge William Sterling wasn't just a man, he was an institution, a titan carved from granite and integrity. 40 years he sat on the Supreme Court bench, a living legend whose name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear in every law school in the country. He was also the man who actually raised me, the one who taught me how to tie my shoes, how to ride a bike, and how to spot a lie from 100 paces. He did all this while my parents, Isabella and Mark, were off living their best lives, a glamorous whirlwind of social events and aspiring business ventures, pretending the daughter they created didn't exist. His funeral was a massive state event. The cathedral was overflowing. Every judge, every high-powered attorney, every politician in a 100-mile radius showed up to pay their respects to the giant who had shaped the law for nearly half a century. I stood at the pulpit and delivered the eulogy, my voice steady even as my heart felt like a hollowed-out cavern. And through it all, I could see them, my parents. They sat in the very back row, two shadowy figures who had arrived 20 minutes late, slipping in during a hymn as if trying to avoid being noticed. They left before the final prayer, before the reception, before anyone could offer them condolences for a father they barely knew. Classic Isabella and Mark behavior. I hadn't seen them in over a decade, not since I turned 18 and my grandmother died. They showed up for that funeral too, for exactly 90 minutes, long enough to be seen, long enough to sign the guest book, before disappearing again into their self-absorbed lives. After Grandma Helen passed, it was just Grandpa and me against the world. He was 73 then, his mind still a steel trap, his wit as sharp as ever, still working, still fighting, and still making sure I had every opportunity he could possibly provide. Here's the thing you need to understand about my parents. My mother, Isabella, got pregnant at 18. She was beautiful, ambitious, and decided motherhood cramped her impeccable style. My father, Mark, was a promising hockey player with dreams of going pro, a man whose ambition was only outmatched by his ego. A baby didn't fit their aesthetic, so they did what profoundly selfish people always do: they abdicated responsibility. They dropped me off at my grandparents' house when I was 3 months old and basically vanished, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of expensive perfume and broken promises. Growing up in my grandparents' house wasn't just a different home. It was a completely different universe from whatever world my parents inhabited. And honestly, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. My earliest memory isn't of a toy or a place, but a feeling. I must have been 4 years old, standing on a wobbly stool in Grandma Helen's sun-drenched kitchen, a ridiculous chef's hat slipping over my eyes. We were making chocolate chip cookies, her secret recipe, and she let me pour in the chocolate chips. I remember her laughing, a sound like wind chimes as half the bag tumbled into the bowl. "Oh, darling," she'd chuckled, "the best cookies always have extra love and extra chocolate." She never got frustrated, never rushed me. Grandpa William would come home from the courthouse, still wearing his heavy black robes, and the first thing he'd do was scoop me up in his arms, flour in my hair and all. He'd ask about my day with the focused intensity of a man hearing oral arguments, listening to my rambling stories about the ants I found in the garden or the lopsided picture I drew of our dog, as if I were presenting evidence that could change the world. They were my world. They never, not once, badmouthed my parents to me. When I'd ask with the innocent cruelty of a child why mommy and daddy didn't live with us, Grandma would get this soft, faraway look in her eyes. "They're just very busy with important things, sweetheart." And I believed her for years. Kids believe what they're told when the people telling them are kind. But I wasn't stupid. I started noticing the small, sharp differences. I saw how other kids' parents swarmed them after school plays, while I always had my grandparents, a proud two-person army. I heard friends chattering about family game nights, while my evenings were spent with two people who went to bed at 9 p.m. And then there were the obligatory appearances from Isabella and Mark, twice a year like clockwork. Christmas and maybe my birthday if the stars aligned. They show up bearing expensive gifts that felt more like atonement than affection. Designer clothes I'd never wear, electronics I didn't need, things that screamed, "We spent money, so our parental duty is fulfilled." I remember one Christmas, I was 10. Isabella wafted in, draped in a fur coat and diamond earrings, on her phone the entire time. She barely looked at me as she handed over a sleek, wrapped box. Inside was a tablet. I already had one from Grandpa. When I tried to tell her, she waved a dismissive, perfectly manicured hand. "Well, now you have two, give one to a friend, whatever." Across the room, I saw Grandma Helen's jaw tighten. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. She just came over, put a warm arm around my shoulder, and suggested we go check on the cookies in the kitchen. As soon as we were out of sight, she hugged me tight and whispered, "Some people show love with presents. Your grandfather and I show love with our presents. One of those matters a whole lot more than the other." The first time the carefully constructed fantasy cracked, I was 7 years old. It was the annual Christmas concert at school, the kind of event that feels like the center of the universe when you're that age. I had a solo 3 whole lines in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and I had practiced for weeks, my voice squeaking with a mixture of terror and excitement. On the big night, my grandparents were right there in the front row, a beacon of support. Grandpa was holding his enormous, old-fashioned video camera, and Grandma was clutching a bouquet of flowers she'd picked from her own garden, even though it was December. I stood on that stage, the hot lights making my scratchy felt antlers itch, and I sang my heart out. After the concert, a whirlwind of proud parents engulfed their children. I saw my friend Emma getting hugged by both her mom and dad, taking endless photos. I looked at my grandparents who were beaming, and the question just tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop it. Why didn't mommy and daddy come? I watched Grandma's face do this complicated, heartbreaking thing where she tried to smile, but her eyes were just sad. "They wanted to, sweetheart," she said, her voice a little too bright. "They just couldn't make it this time." But I knew. I had been hiding in the hallway the week before when she was on the phone with Isabella, her voice pleading. I heard the long, cold silence on the other end, followed by the flimsy excuse about Mark's team holiday party. I learned to stop asking after that. The silence was easier than the lie. The fantasy didn't just crack, though, it shattered completely when I was 12. I was old enough to stop asking, but not old enough to stop listening. Isabella had come for one of her brief, obligatory visits, and Mark had dropped her off. I was upstairs in my room, supposedly doing homework, but I could hear their voices through the open window. Grandpa met him at the door. "One day that girl is going to be a grown woman," Grandpa said, and I recognized that tone, his quiet, lethal courtroom voice, the one that meant he was genuinely angry. "And she's going to remember who showed up for her. You still have time, Mark. You still have time to change what she remembers." And then Mark laughed. It was a short, barking sound devoid of any real humor. "Save the lecture, Your Honor," he sneered. "Isabella and I are doing fine. Clara is provided for. She has a roof over her head and food on the table. That's what matters." I felt the air leave my lungs. Provided for. Grandpa repeated the words slowly, as if they were a foreign language he was trying to decipher. "Is that what you think parenting is? Writing checks?" The final blow came when Mark shot back. "It's more than you ever did for Isabella." Wrong thing to say, Grandpa's voice dropped even lower. "I raised my daughter. I was at every game, every recital, every single moment. She chose to abandon hers. Don't you dare suggest I'm the failure here." Mark left. He never tried to come inside the house again. And in that moment, listening from the top of the stairs, I understood with a cold, terrifying clarity. I wasn't a daughter to him. I was an expense he'd outsourced. I stopped caring around 15. By then, I'd accepted reality. They weren't my parents. They were just people I happened to share DNA with. The world ended on a Tuesday afternoon. I was 18, just weeks away from starting my freshman year at Boston University, sitting in the university library during a campus orientation event. I remember the smell of old paper and the quiet, reverent hush of the room. My phone vibrated against the oak table, a jarring intrusion. It was Grandpa. I stepped into the echoing marble hallway to answer, a smile on my face, ready to tell him about my first tour of the law school building. But his voice, it wasn't his voice. It was a small, broken thing, a sound I'd never heard before, stripped of all its judicial authority. "Clara," he choked out, "she's gone, your grandma, she's gone." The world tilted on its axis. He told me it was a stroke, massive and sudden. She had been in her garden, her favorite place on earth, planting the tulip bulbs for next spring when it happened. The neighbor found her. I don't remember the rest of the call. I just remember driving home that night, 6 hours straight through a blur of headlights and tears, the wail of the engine a poor substitute for the screaming in my own head. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. I found him in the back garden, sitting on the small stone bench beside her rose bushes. The air was cold and sharp with the smell of overturned earth. He was just sitting there in the darkness, not crying, just staring into the space where she should have been, holding the small, papery tulip bulbs in his hands as if they were the last pieces of her he had left. I sat down next to him, and we didn't say anything. We just sat there together in the crushing silence until the sun came up, two survivors on a desolate shore. Isabella and Mark came to the funeral. They stayed for the service, Isabella dabbing at dry eyes with a pristine handkerchief, Mark checking his watch 3 times during the eulogy. They didn't help with the arrangements. They didn't help Grandpa sort through 60 years of a shared life packed into closets and drawers. They just showed up long enough to be seen, offered a few hollow platitudes. "She's in a better place now," Isabella whispered to me, her breath smelling of mints and indifference, and then they left immediately after, citing a prior engagement. A prior engagement more important than the woman who raised their own daughter. That was the moment I stopped making excuses for them. That was the moment I accepted that some people are just fundamentally, irrevocably selfish. In the quiet, aching weeks that followed, Grandpa and I learned to live without her. It was a half-life, a world drained of its color, but we had each other. Those Sunday dinners became more than a tradition, they became a lifeline. And in that shared darkness, he started talking to me about his work in a way he never had before. He didn't just talk about cases, he talked about justice as a living, breathing thing. The law is supposed to be blind, Clara, he said one night over Chinese takeout, but the people who interpret it are not. The trick is knowing when your humanity makes you more just and when it makes you biased. He told me about decisions that haunted him, about the weight of knowing his words could shatter or rebuild a life. And then he looked at me, his eyes clear and intense. Your grandmother believed in order, in things being right. The law, at its best, is that. It's a promise that the selfish don't always get to win. In that moment, something inside me solidified. It wasn't just a career path anymore, it was a promise. Law school was brutal, a 3-year crucible designed to forge lawyers or break them. Every late night spent buried in casebooks, every mock trial where I felt my arguments crumble, every single moment I wanted to quit, I thought about him. I thought about the legacy he was building, not just in the hallowed halls of the Supreme Court, but in me. I graduated summa cum laude. Grandpa was there in the front row, his old video camera perched on his shoulder, his face a perfect picture of unrestrained pride. My parents, they sent a card, a generic store-bought Hallmark card with a glittery owl on the front. Inside, a pre-printed message wished me success, and below it, in my mother's elegant but impersonal script, it said, "Congratulations on your Master of Jurisprudence. Love, Mom and Dad." I had a Juris Doctor. They hadn't even cared enough to get the name of the degree right. Grandpa used his considerable influence to get my resume onto the right desk at the district attorney's office. I didn't know it then. I thought I'd earned the interview purely on merits. I only found out years later that he'd made a single, quiet call, vouching for me personally, promising I wouldn't waste the opportunity. I didn't. I worked harder than anyone in that office. I was the first one in, the last one out. I devoured the cases other prosecutors avoided, the ones that were too complex, too politically sensitive, the ones with a high chance of failure. And it turned out I had an instinct for it, a talent for seeing the lie buried in page 500 of a discovery document. By my second year, I was handling major cases, diving headfirst into the dark underbelly of corporate America. Financial fraud, political corruption, the kind of sophisticated white-collar crime that required a different kind of warfare. I developed a reputation fast, thorough, prepared, relentless. The work consumed me. 70-hour weeks were my normal. I lived on black coffee, takeout, and the cold, thrilling satisfaction of watching sharks in $1,000 suits finally face consequences. My personal life was non-existent, a barren landscape with one sacred oasis, Sunday dinners with Grandpa. No matter how exhausted I was, I showed up. By the time I was 30, I was a senior prosecutor, handling cases that made national headlines. I once spent 6 months prosecuting the CEO of Vanderbilt Holdings for a multi-billion-dollar securities fraud scheme. My face was on the evening news for weeks. My parents never had a clue. They saw the headlines, I'm sure of it. They probably even saw my face, a ghost they didn't recognize, and muttered something about corporate greed before changing the channel. To them, I was still just Clara, probably working some boring office job, if they thought about me at all. I know this for a fact because Isabella called me once during that period, the first time in 3 years. She wanted a recommendation for a good tax attorney for one of Mark's failing businesses. She had no idea she was asking for legal advice from the very prosecutor who was currently dismantling a financial empire built on tax evasion. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. He died at 87, peacefully in his sleep. One moment he was here, a steadfast mountain in my life, and the next he was gone. The familiar, crushing emptiness I felt when Grandma died returned, but this time it was different. I wasn't a lost 18-year-old girl anymore, adrift in a sea of grief. I was 32, a woman forged in the fire of his love and wisdom. I was exactly who he had raised me to be, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he had prepared me even for this. The will reading happened 1 week later in a stuffy, wood-paneled office that smelled of old leather and finality. I expected a few personal items, his collection of first edition law books, maybe his worn gold watch, things that held memories. I sat there, a quiet spectator in my own life, as his attorney, a kind man named Mr. Davies, cleared his throat and began to read. What I got wasn't a keepsake, it was everything. The house I grew up in, a sprawling investment portfolio, savings, life insurance, a total estate valued at over $10 million. Everything he had spent a lifetime building, he left to me. The room fell silent, the weight of his decision pressing down on me. But it wasn't the money that made me gasp. It was the provision that came with it, contained in a heavy, cream-colored envelope sealed with his judicial crest. Mr. Davies slid it across the polished desk. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. His familiar, elegant handwriting filled the page. "My dearest Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. But my love for you, my pride in you, continues. You are, and always have been, the greatest joy of my life. I leave you everything because you earned it. Not through the accident of blood, though you are my blood. You earned it by showing up day after day, year after year. You earned it through loving me and your grandmother when others could not be bothered. Your parents made their choice a long, long time ago. This is mine. Be strong, my girl, I am always with you." I cried reading that, not sad tears. These were validation tears, a lifetime of unspoken questions finally answered. He saw me, he had always seen me. As I folded the letter, Mr. Davies pushed a second, much thicker manila envelope toward me. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice grave. "Your grandfather was the best legal strategist I ever knew. He taught you how to fight in court. This was his final lesson." I opened the clasp. It wasn't just documentation, it was a dossier, a weapon. Decades of bank statements showing the monthly $3,000 payments to Isabella, totaling nearly $1 million. Printed emails from her, each one a masterclass in manipulation, asking for more. A log of text messages, promising to visit and then canceling at the last minute with flimsy excuses. Scanned letters from Mark, practically begging for money to fund one failed business venture after another. It was a meticulously organized chronology of their neglect and their greed, complete with color-coded tabs and highlighted sections. "Your grandfather anticipated they might contest this," Mr. Davies said quietly. "He wanted you armed not just with proof, but with an arsenal. He said justice requires preparation, the smartest man I ever knew." My grandfather's foresight was, as always, chillingly accurate. 30 days. Almost to the hour after the will reading, my phone rang. It was my attorney, Thomas, his voice grim. "Clara, they filed. It just came across my desk." I was standing in the middle of a packed courtroom, about to deliver my closing argument in a massive insider trading case. The defendant, a slick hedge fund manager, was staring me down with the same entitled arrogance I'd seen on my father's face 1,000 times. I had to physically press my knuckles into my mouth to keep from laughing out loud. The universe, it seems, has a twisted sense of humor. The lawsuit was a work of pure, unadulterated fiction. In it, they painted me as a manipulative predator, a calculating schemer who had isolated a vulnerable, grief-stricken old man to secure his fortune. They claimed Judge Sterling was mentally incompetent, suffering from profound depression, and that I had exerted undue influence. It was the exact playbook I'd seen used by 100 guilty men trying to escape the consequences of their actions. The irony was staggering. They were accusing me, a senior prosecutor for the state, of masterminding a long con against one of the sharpest legal minds in history. They assumed I was still that abandoned baby, that quiet, bookish girl who flinched when they raised their voices. They thought I'd be easy to intimidate, that I'd crumble and offer a settlement to make the ugly mess go away. They had no idea I'd spent the last decade prosecuting people who believed they were untouchable, men who thought the law was for little people. They had no idea their own father-in-law, their own father, had spent years personally training me for exactly this moment, teaching me how to dismantle a weak argument and expose a lie with surgical precision. My grandfather taught me to think 3 moves ahead. In death, he was still 5 moves ahead of them. But their biggest, most catastrophic mistake wasn't underestimating me. It was their complete ignorance of the legal world my grandfather had built, the world I now inhabited. Their lawsuit wasn't just a mistake, it was a tactical catastrophe. Because the case had been assigned to the Honorable Judge Marcus Evans. Judge Evans, who had been my grandfather's very first law clerk 23 years ago. Judge Evans, who still called my grandfather the maestro. Judge Evans, who knew exactly who I was, what I did, and what William Sterling meant to me. They didn't just walk into a courtroom, they walked into my grandfather's house. Have you ever faced a battle that your entire life had unknowingly prepared you for? Tell me about it in the comments. Which brings us back to that courtroom, to that charged, silent moment after Judge Evans's pen hit the desk. He cleared his throat, his composure returning, but his eyes, when they met mine, held a new depth, a flicker of shared history. He turned his attention to my parents' lawyer, a man named Richard Vance who specialized in weaponizing sympathy when facts were in short supply. Mr. Vance, the judge said, his voice resonating with judicial calm, before we proceed, I am obligated to disclose for the record that I had a long and deeply respected professional relationship with the late Judge Sterling. I clerked for him. I considered him a mentor. If either party objects to me hearing this case on the grounds of potential bias, you must speak now. I watched Vance whisper frantically with my parents. I could see the conflict play out on their faces. Isabella looked nervous, a predator suddenly unsure of the terrain. Mark, ever the impatient one, just looked annoyed, as if this procedural hiccup was wasting his valuable time. Vance, blinded by his own arrogance and smelling an opportunity to flatter the judge, made the final, fatal decision. He straightened his tie and stood. No objection, Your Honor. My clients have the utmost faith in your impartiality. Big mistake, a colossal, story-ending mistake. Judge Evans gave a single, curt nod. Then let us proceed, Mr. Vance, your opening statement. And that's when the show began. Vance's opening was a masterclass in fiction. And look, I've prosecuted enough seasoned liars to recognize raw talent when I see it. The man was good. He painted Isabella not as a neglectful mother, but as a devoted daughter, cruelly separated from her loving father by manipulative grandparents who poisoned the well of their relationship. He described me as calculating, a predator in the guise of a caregiver, someone who methodically isolated an elderly man in his grief to secure an inheritance. Judge Sterling was suffering, Vance argued, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy from the profound, disorienting grief of losing his wife of 60 years. He was vulnerable, and the defendant exploited that vulnerability. This will does not reflect Judge Sterling's true wishes. It reflects Clara Sterling's calculated campaign to inherit his wealth. I kept my face a neutral mask, but inside, my prosecutor's brain was whirring, cataloging every lie, every distortion, every emotional landmine he planted for the cross-examination to come. Then they called their first witness, Isabella Morrison. She stood smoothing the front of her conservative charcoal dress, an outfit chosen for its somber humility, minimal makeup, hair pulled back in a simple bun. She looked every bit the grieving daughter. It was an almost convincing performance if you didn't know the actress. She took the oath, her voice wavering just enough to be convincing, and sat down. Vance approached her with practiced gentleness. Mrs. Morrison, could you please describe your relationship with your father? Isabella's eyes immediately welled with tears. He was everything to me, she whispered, dabbing her eye with a tissue. Where did that tissue even come from? Was it a prop tucked into her sleeve specifically for this moment? He was my hero, and when I had Clara, he was so excited to be a grandfather. I was so young, just 18. When he offered to watch Clara while Mark and I got established, I thought it was temporary. Temporary, an interesting spin on 32 years of abandonment. But it became permanent, Vance prompted. Yes, she said, her voice finally breaking. They kept her, they made me feel guilty for wanting a career, for wanting a life. They turned my own daughter against me. I felt Thomas, my lawyer, glance at me from the corner of my eye. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I was fine. Let her dig the hole deeper. I was more than happy to hand her the shovel. Thomas stood, he didn't rush. He let the echo of Isabella's breaking voice hang in the air for a moment before he moved. He approached my mother not like an attorney questioning a witness, but like a surgeon preparing for an incision, precise, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. Mrs. Morrison, he began, his voice a low, steady baritone that cut through the courtroom's tension. You were 18 when your daughter Clara was born, is that correct? Yes. And you voluntarily left her in the care of your parents when she was 3 months old. Her back stiffened. It wasn't like that, it was a temporary arrangement. A simple yes or no will suffice, Mrs. Morrison. She glared at him. Yes, but… Thank you, Thomas said, cutting her off cleanly. He turned to his table and produced a large, leather-bound day planner. My breath caught in my throat. It was my grandfather's, the one he kept on his desk for 40 years. Your father, Judge Sterling, kept meticulous records, Thomas stated, opening it to a bookmarked page. According to this, you visited your infant daughter a total of 4 times in her first year. Christmas, Easter, her first birthday, and 1 Saturday in July. Is that accurate? Isabella's face flushed a deep, ugly red. I was dealing with a lot. I was young. Mark and I were trying to build a life. Of course, Thomas said, his tone dangerously smooth. Let's discuss that life. Your husband was a professional hockey player, earning a substantial salary. In fact, tax records show he made over $2 million during his career, yet you still required monthly financial assistance from your father. We had expenses, she snapped. Expenses that $2 million couldn't cover. Thomas didn't wait for an answer. He pulled the first document from my grandfather's dossier, a bank statement. Your father gave you $3,000 a month every month, starting when Clara was an infant and continuing for over 20 years. That's over $800,000, Mrs. Morrison, not including additional lump sums. What was that money used for? Vance shot to his feet. Objection, relevance. The plaintiffs are claiming they deserve a share of the estate, Your Honor, Thomas countered without looking away from Isabella. I am simply establishing a baseline of what they have already received. Judge Evans's expression was unreadable. Overruled. Answer the question, Mrs. Morrison. She shifted uncomfortably. Living expenses, rent, food, normal things. Normal things, Thomas repeated. He then produced a new document. Exhibit D, Your Honor. He handed a copy to Vance and my mother. This is an email from you to your father, dated June 12th, 6 years ago. In it, you ask for an advance of $10,000 for a much-needed trip to Tuscany. You describe the villa you plan to rent in great detail. He paused, letting the words sink in. And this, he said, producing another paper, is Exhibit E, a text message you sent to your father on June 15th, 3 days later. In it, you cancel your planned visit for Father's Day, claiming you were terribly ill and couldn't travel. You took his money and then couldn't be bothered to drive 2 hours to see him, correct? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Isabella stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. In the last 10 years of your father's life, Thomas pressed on, his voice like ice, how many times did you see him? I don't know the exact number. Thomas held up another of my grandfather's logs. The number is 8 times in 10 years, less than once a year. And when he retired and informed you that while the monthly payments would continue, the extra advances would have to stop, you visited him exactly 0 times in the following 3 years. True or false? She didn't answer. She just stared at him, her carefully constructed facade shattering into a million pieces. Thomas turned to the judge. Or perhaps, Mrs. Morrison, you simply had no use for him anymore when the ATM ran dry. He looked back at her broken form. No further questions. Mark took the stand next, and if Isabella's performance was an overwrought tragedy, his was a minimalist play about a man who would rather be anywhere else. He settled into the witness box, fidgeting with the cufflink of his $1,000 suit like a CEO stuck in a mandatory HR meeting. He wasn't nervous, he was bored. Vance began with the same gentle, leading questions. Mr. Morrison, describe your relationship with your father-in-law, Judge Sterling. He was a judge, I was a hockey player, Mark said with a shrug. Our worlds didn't overlap much, but I respected him. Respected him, the words were so hollow they nearly echoed. Coming from a man who avoided entering Judge Sterling's house for 2 decades, it was rich. Vance walked him through the same tired victim narrative, how they tried so hard to be involved, how the overbearing grandparents made it difficult, how they felt pushed out. Mark's answers were clipped and lazy, his eyes constantly darting to the clock on the courtroom wall. The inconvenience of it all was radiating off him in palpable waves. Then Thomas rose, he didn't even bother to bring notes. Mr. Morrison, he began, you testified that you wanted to be involved in your daughter's life. Yes, Mark said, a hint of defiance in his voice. How many of her school events did you attend? Recitals, soccer games, parent-teacher conferences. Can you name just one? Silence. Mark blinked, his mind a complete blank. He glanced helplessly at Vance, who could only offer a sympathetic grimace. I was traveling a lot with the team. Your professional hockey career ended when Clara was 8 years old, Mr. Morrison. After that, you lived just 2 hours away. Let me rephrase. In the 24 years that followed, how many times did you see her? We had visits, Mark mumbled. How many? Thomas pressed, his voice unyielding. I'm asking for a number. I don't remember exactly. Would it surprise you to learn that according to Clara's recollection, and corroborated by visitor logs your father-in-law kept, you came inside Judge Sterling's house fewer than 5 times in 24 years, that you mostly stayed in the car, honking the horn like a taxi driver. Mark's jaw tightened. That house was tense. The judge didn't like me. Why didn't he like you, Mr. Morrison? I don't know, he snapped. He was judgmental. Or perhaps, Thomas said, pulling another set of documents from the dossier, he judged you for your actions. He judged you for abandoning your daughter and then repeatedly coming to him, hand out, asking for money when your businesses failed. Let's discuss those failures, shall we? A sports bar that lasted 11 months, a coaching company with 0 clients, a memorabilia shop that filed for bankruptcy. Each time you asked Judge Sterling for a bailout, correct? He offered, Mark shot back. He offered after you asked, Thomas corrected coolly. And he gave you money despite barely tolerating you. Why? Because he loved his daughter and by extension, he wanted to help her family, even when her husband never once showed up for his granddaughter. And now, after all that, you stand here claiming you deserve more. We're family, Mark sputtered, his face reddening. We deserve something. Family, Thomas repeated slowly, the word hanging in the air. Let's talk about family. He nodded to his assistant, and the courtroom projector flickered to life. An image filled the screen behind Mark. It was me, age 25 in my cap and gown, beaming, holding my Juris Doctor degree. On either side of me were my grandparents. Grandpa William, his face etched with a pride so profound it was almost painful to look at, and Grandma Helen, her eyes shining with tears of joy. This is from Clara's law school graduation, Mr. Morrison. There's Judge Sterling, there's her grandmother. Where are you? Mark stared at the screen. I think I had something that day. You didn't come, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You missed her high school graduation, her college graduation, and this moment. You missed every significant achievement of her life, and now you want half of the estate earned by the man who actually showed up. Vance jumped up, objection, argumentative. Sustained, Judge Evans said, his eyes lingering on the photograph for a moment too long. Move on, Mr. Goldstein. Thomas nodded, no further questions. As their final, desperate gambit, Vance called their expert witness, a psychiatrist named Dr. Raymond Hughes, a man who had never met my grandfather. This was their incompetence angle, a move so bold it bordered on reckless. Dr. Hughes, Vance began, based on Judge Sterling's medical records, can you speak to his mental state in his final years? Based on the records, Dr. Hughes said pompously, Judge Sterling showed signs of depression following his wife's death. In elderly patients, this can lead to impaired judgment and vulnerability to suggestion from caregivers. For his cross-examination, Thomas stood and approached the witness stand with an air of almost casual curiosity. Doctor, you never met Judge Sterling, did you? No, I did not. Never spoke to him, never evaluated him in any capacity. My opinion is based on the medical records. Medical records, Thomas clarified, which show standard checkups with perfectly normal cognitive results for a man his age. Can you please point to the specific page in these records where any physician diagnosed Judge Sterling with clinical depression? Dr. Hughes flipped through the papers, his confidence visibly faltering. Well, it's not explicitly stated, but given the circumstances. Thomas held up a hand. So to be clear for the court, you have diagnosed a man you never met with a condition not present in his official medical records, based purely on your own speculation, for which you are being paid a handsome fee of $500 an hour. And you are using that imaginary diagnosis to question the mental competency of a man who served for 40 years on the Supreme Court. Is that a fair summary of your testimony? The doctor sputtered, but Thomas was already walking away. No further questions. After Vance's case crumbled under the weight of its own fiction, the court took a brief recess. My parents' side had been a house of cards, built on speculation and emotional theater. Now it was our turn to build a fortress, and Thomas Goldstein was a master architect. He didn't call witnesses, he summoned pillars of integrity. The first was Judge Andrew Mitchell, a man who had served on the Supreme Court with my grandfather for over 20 years. He was a legend in his own right, a man whose presence alone commanded the courtroom's absolute attention. He walked to the stand with a slow, deliberate gravity, his eyes, sharp and intelligent behind gold-rimmed glasses, fixed on Judge Evans. Judge Mitchell, Thomas began, you worked with Judge Sterling for 2 decades. Did you ever observe any decline in his mental faculties in his later years? Absolutely not, Judge Mitchell said, his voice a firm, resonant bass that filled the room. William Sterling's mind was a weapon of legal precision until the day he died. We had lunch every Thursday. We debated complex legal theories, we argued over current cases, we dissected contracts for fun. His mind was as clear at 87 as it was at 60. To suggest otherwise is not just an error, it is an insult to his memory. Did he ever discuss his estate plans with you? Thomas asked. Frequently, Judge Mitchell confirmed. He told me quite explicitly that he was leaving everything to Clara. He said she had earned it through decades of unwavering devotion. He was very clear about it. I remember one lunch not long before he passed. He looked at me and said, a man's legacy isn't what he leaves to people, Andrew, it's what he leaves in them. Clara is my legacy, the rest is just paper. Thomas called 3 more witnesses in quick succession. A retired cardiologist who had been my grandfather's doctor and friend for 30 years, a university chancellor who played chess with him every Sunday afternoon, and a former governor. They were an army of character witnesses, each one testifying to my grandfather's mental sharpness, his keen sense of humor, and his unwavering integrity. Each one confirmed he had discussed his will openly and was completely, unequivocally intentional in his decisions. But the final, devastating blow came from the last witness, Margaret Chen. She had been my grandfather's estate attorney for 30 years, a petite woman with an iron spine and a mind that missed nothing. She took the stand with a calm, professional poise that made Vance and my parents visibly shrink in their seats. Ms. Chen, Thomas said, walk us through the creation of Judge Sterling's final will. He contacted me 2 years before his death, she began, her voice crisp and clear. He wanted to update everything. We met 4 times. He was extraordinarily specific. He wanted Clara to inherit everything, and he wanted his daughter Isabella's monthly allowance to be terminated upon his death. She paused, then looked directly at Thomas. He also anticipated that this exact situation might occur. "What do you mean?" Thomas prompted. "He brought me a file," she said, nodding toward the thick dossier on Thomas's table. That one, he had been compiling it for years. "He told me, Margaret, my daughter will see this not as an inheritance, but as a transaction. And when a transaction doesn't go her way, she will litigate. I want the truth to have a voice in that courtroom, even when I no longer do." He wasn't confused, he wasn't coerced. He was a brilliant man preparing for one last, regrettable battle. Vance had nothing on cross-examination. Margaret Chen was an unshakable fortress of fact. As the court recessed for the day, I caught my mother's eye across the courtroom. This time she didn't look away, she just looked defeated. Good she should be, because tomorrow I would testify. Tomorrow I would finally get to speak my truth, under oath, with a judge who already knew the story. I woke up early, the pre-dawn light a soft gray against my window. My nerves were humming, a low electric thrum beneath my skin, but it wasn't from fear. It was anticipation. For 32 years, my story had been a quiet, private ache. Today, I would finally tell it out loud, and they would have to sit there and listen, bound by the rules of a courtroom they had foolishly entered. I dressed carefully, methodically, a navy suit, sharp and professional. Simple pearl earrings, the ones my grandmother gave me. Hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. I was dressing not for sympathy, but for credibility. I was dressing like a woman who had earned every single penny. Thomas met me at the courthouse steps. "You ready?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "More than ready," I replied. "Remember," he cautioned, "just tell your truth. Don't let Vance get under your skin. He's going to try to provoke you." I gave him a small, tight smile. "I prosecute violent criminals for a living, Thomas. I know how to handle hostile questioning." The courtroom was packed, word had spread. The legal community was a small, gossipy world, and the spectacle of Judge Sterling's estranged daughter suing his beloved granddaughter was the hottest ticket in town. I walked to the stand, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the marble floor. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Finally. Thomas started gently. "Clara, please tell the court about your childhood." I took a deep, steadying breath and looked not at the judge, not at the jury, but directly at my mother. I was born when my mother was 18. She and my father decided they weren't ready for parenthood. When I was 3 months old, they brought me to my grandparents. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement became my entire life. They left and rarely returned. Thomas walked me through it all. The missed birthdays, the broken promises, the Christmas Isabella spent on her phone. I kept my voice steady, factual, laying out the bricks of their neglect one by one, building a wall of irrefutable truths. When I spoke of my grandparents, my voice softened. I told them about the school plays, the soccer games, the way my grandfather taught me that justice was a promise. "Did Isabella and Mark contribute financially to your upbringing?" Thomas asked. "No," I said clearly. "My grandparents paid for everything, my clothes, my education, my life. My biological parents took money from my grandfather, but they never gave anything to me. Not time, not support, not a single dollar." My voice caught slightly only once when I spoke of my best friend. "He wasn't just my grandfather," I said, clearing my throat. "He was my closest advisor and my dearest friend." Thomas sat down. Now it was Vance's turn. He approached me slowly, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "Miss Sterling," he began, his voice oozing condescension, "you paint a very bleak picture. But couldn't you, as you got older, have reached out more, tried harder to build a bridge?" "I was a child for most of that time, Mr. Vance," I replied calmly. It is not a child's job to build bridges to their parents. As an adult, I realized they weren't interested in a bridge, they were interested in a bank. I stopped chasing people who didn't want to be caught. He paced, trying another angle. You portray yourself as this devoted granddaughter, but isn't it true that you isolated your grandfather? That you made yourself so indispensable that he felt he had to leave you his money? I didn't even blink. I didn't need to isolate him. They isolated themselves by their own absence. My grandfather didn't make decisions based on feelings, he made them based on facts, and the fact was I was there. He sneered, "How convenient. Miss Sterling, isn't it true that you knew exactly what you stood to inherit? That this entire 32-year performance was about positioning yourself for this exact moment?" He lined in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I leaned forward slightly, meeting his gaze, and let the entire courtroom hear my response. "Mr. Vance, I spent years loving my grandfather. If inheritance was my motivation, I wasted an incredible amount of time. I could have been building my own wealth instead of spending every Sunday having dinner with an old man. But I chose him. I chose him because he was worth more than any amount of money, a concept your clients have never and will never understand." Vance's face went white. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. "No further questions," he mumbled, retreating to his table. I stepped down from the stand and returned to my seat. Thomas leaned over. "You did great." I just nodded, my eyes fixed on my mother. She was crying, real tears this time. Whether from genuine remorse or the cold, hard realization that she was going to lose, I couldn't tell. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't care. Closing arguments were scheduled for 9 a.m. I barely slept, but not from worry. This was the final act. One way or another, by the end of the day, my grandfather's last wishes would either be honored or desecrated by the two people who had forsaken him in life. The courtroom was a tinderbox of anticipation, the gallery packed with lawyers and clerks eager to witness the final verdict. Judge Evans took the bench, his face an impassive mask, and nodded at Vance. "Mr. Palmer, your closing argument." Vance launched into his final appeal, a desperate, flimsy tapestry woven from cliches. He talked about blood being thicker than water, about the sacred bond between a father and a daughter. He painted Judge Sterling as a sad, lonely old man, easily swayed by the only person who paid him any attention. It was a pathetic, last-ditch effort to sell a story that the evidence had already shredded. When he sat down, the silence was heavy with dismissal. Then Thomas stood. He didn't need theatrics. The facts were his orchestra. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm and resonant, "this case is and always has been simple. Judge William Sterling was a brilliant legal mind who spent 40 years making carefully considered decisions. His will was no different. He left his estate to the person who earned it, not through manipulation, but through 3 decades of consistent, unwavering love and presence." He methodically walked the judge through the mountain of evidence, the financial records, the calendars, the testimony from my grandfather's esteemed colleagues. "The plaintiffs claim Judge Sterling was unduly influenced," Thomas said, turning to look directly at the judge. "But the evidence shows he was simply making a logical choice based on observed behavior. He gave his daughter every opportunity to be present. She failed to show up. Clara Sterling did show up, every single day. That is not manipulation, Your Honor, that is devotion." Then he made his riskiest, most brilliant move. "Your Honor, you knew Judge Sterling, you clerked for him, you saw his character firsthand. Was he a man who could be so easily manipulated? Or was he a man who made his decisions based on principle and irrefutable observation?" Judge Evans's expression remained neutral. "The court will take a brief recess to review the evidence and render a decision." 30 minutes felt like a lifetime. Finally, the bailiff called us back. Judge Evans returned, a thick folder in his hand. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. "I have reviewed all evidence and testimony carefully," he began, his voice filling the now silent room. He looked directly at my parents. The plaintiffs argue that Judge Sterling was unduly influenced and mentally incompetent. The evidence does not support either claim. In fact, it overwhelmingly refutes them. He detailed the testimony from Judge Mitchell, the doctors, the friends. What the evidence does show, he continued, his voice hardening, is a pattern of absence by the plaintiffs and a pattern of presence by the defendant. A pattern of financial taking by the plaintiffs and a pattern of devoted care by the defendant. A pattern of broken promises by the plaintiffs and kept commitments by the defendant. Judge Sterling didn't need to be manipulated into seeing this pattern. He lived it for 32 years. My chest tightened. I could barely breathe. Therefore, Judge Evans declared, his voice ringing with authority, the court finds that Judge Sterling's will reflects his true and final intentions. The plaintiff's petition is denied. The will stands as written. Isabella let out a choked sob. Mark swore under his breath. But Judge Evans wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes like steel. Furthermore, given that this lawsuit was brought forth without merit and based on claims verifiably contradicted by the evidence, I find it to be a frivolous and malicious action. I am therefore awarding full attorney's fees to the defendant. The plaintiffs will bear the entire cost of this litigation. Vance shot up. Your Honor, we respectfully. Crack, the gavel came down with a sound like a rifle shot, echoing through the stunned silence. My ruling stands, Counselor, we are adjourned. It was over just like that. Thomas shook my hand, a wide grin on his face. As we gathered our things, my mother approached, her face a mess of streaked mascara and desperation. Clara, please, she begged, reaching for my arm. Can we talk? I looked at her, really looked at her, a 50-year-old woman looking small and pathetic. There's nothing to talk about, Isabella. I'm your mother, she cried. I pulled my arm back as if her touch were toxic. You are the woman who gave birth to me, I said, my voice cold and final. My mother was Helen Sterling. My father was William Sterling. They earned those titles by showing up. You are just a stranger who took my grandfather's money for 30 years and now wants more. Please, she whispered, I made mistakes. No, I said, cutting her off for the last time. You had every chance, every birthday, every Christmas, every Sunday dinner for 32 years. You chose not to show up. You don't get to claim that title now just because the money is gone. I turned my back on her and walked out of that courtroom. Behind me, I heard her sobbing and Mark's angry voice telling her to pull herself together. But I didn't look back, not once. For the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly free. That freedom was a strange, quiet thing. It didn't come with fireworks, just a profound sense of peace. The first thing I did was visit their graves. I sat on the cool grass beside the simple granite headstones of William and Helen Sterling, and for the first time since he died, I didn't feel the ache of his absence. I felt his presence. We won, Grandpa, I whispered to the wind. They tried to rewrite history, but the truth came out. The tulips Grandma and I had planted years ago were blooming, their vibrant colors a stubborn testament to life and endurance. I stayed there for hours, talking to them both, promising to honor the legacy they had entrusted to me. I thought that was the end of the story. I thought justice had been served and the book was closed. But my grandfather, it turned out, had one final lesson to teach me. 6 months later, life had settled into a new, quiet rhythm. The inheritance sat untouched in a trust, a responsibility I wasn't yet ready to face. I had returned to my work, finding solace in the familiar fight for justice. Then one crisp Saturday morning, my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was a woman I vaguely recognized, Patricia Caldwell, my grandparents' neighbor for 30 years. She was the one who had found my grandmother in the garden. She held a large, dusty shoebox tied with twine. I should have come sooner, she said, her voice soft with apology, but after the trial, I felt you needed to see this. Inside my house, she explained. After my grandfather passed, she had helped him sort through his study. He had asked her to shred most of his old papers, but he'd pointed to this box tucked away in the back of his closet. He just looked at me and said, "Not this one, Patricia. This one is for Clara. Give it to her when the time is right." My hands trembled as I untied the twine and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were letters, dozens of them. All in my grandfather's elegant, familiar script, all of them addressed to Isabella, all of them marked unsent. Patricia quietly saw herself out, leaving me alone with these ghosts of the past. I pulled out the first one, the paper brittle with age. It was dated 20 years ago. "Dear Isabella," it began. "I'm writing this because I can't seem to say it to your face without anger creeping in. Clara had her dance recital today. She was wonderful. She kept looking at the audience, her little face searching for you. I watched her smile falter when she realized you weren't there again. How many more times will I have to watch my granddaughter's heart break because you can't be bothered to show up?" I read through more letters, each one a chronicle of a missed moment, a broken promise, another desperate attempt by my grandfather to understand the daughter he no longer recognized. Some were filled with rage, others with a profound, weary sadness. The last letter was dated just 2 years before his death. "Isabella, I have given you nearly $1 million over the last 30 years. I told myself it was helping you, but I realize now I was just enabling your refusal to grow up. I'm done with the extra money. I'm done rescuing Mark from his failures. I hope someday you'll understand that the greatest gift you ever gave me wasn't your respect or your time. It was Clara. You gave her to me, and in doing so, you saved me after your mother died. She gave my life purpose again. I just wish, for one moment, you could see what you're missing." The letters weren't just evidence for a trial, they were the story of his heart. They were proof of his struggle, his pain, and his ultimate, unwavering choice to prioritize the person who had prioritized him. I kept the letters, adding them to the dossier he had left me. They were his final testimony, the last piece of the puzzle. He hadn't just armed me for a legal battle, he had left me his truth, ensuring I would never have to doubt the righteousness of his love. And in that quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by the words he could never bring himself to send, I finally understood his true legacy. It wasn't the money, it was the proof that love is not about who you give birth to. It's about who you show up for every single day for a lifetime.